Hello and welcome to the Science Set Free podcast. My name is Mark Vernon and I'm talking with Rupert Sheldrake. Hello, Rupert.
Hello, Mark.
Today we want to ask the question, can materialists have free choice? Now, Rupert, this is a slightly puzzling question. What are you driving at by wanting to ask it?
Well, I'm really thinking about materialists themselves, because the theory says the mind's nothing but the activity of the brain, that we are lumbering robots, to use Dawkins' phrase, and that the mind is nothing but a brain which is a genetically programmed computer, and that everything happens in the brain happens through physical and chemical causes, that there's no such thing as a mind which can actually do things. So there's a sense in which this denies any sense of free will. There's just physical causation in the brain. There's no mysterious mind that can intervene and change what happens in the brain. Mental activity is a kind of shadow of brain activity or a kind of illusion. So materialism inherently says there is no free choice, no free will. Everything that I do is because my brain made me do it. But I think where this becomes interesting is in relation to the materialist belief system itself. And you see, I think it's self-contradictory, materialism, as a belief system, because a materialist is saying everything that people do, everything that happens in the world is determined by physical and chemical causes or else by chance, blind chance. And yet they're saying, I believe in materialism, I believe that this is scientific. And if you challenge them, they say, well, here's some evidence to support it. They try and persuade you to become a materialist too. Now, I think that what's going on here is that materialists are inherently inconsistent in that they think everybody else is determined by this kind of causation, but that something in their own mind enables them to stand outside this, to step back and somehow be outside this system, where they have the ability to make free choice, to pay attention to evidence, to be persuaded through rational argument, etc., none of which ought to happen if they are consistent materialists.
So you're saying that it's not enough just to say that things like reason and evidence are just themselves brain states. That is where it collapses in on itself.
Well, reason and evidence no doubt have brain correlates. You know, when you and I believe something or say something or produce evidence, there's something going on in our brain. But if they're nothing but brain states caused by, causal mechanisms, then if they have some status as being potentially true, and that we have some freedom to choose what we believe, then it would suggest the mind is more than just the activity of the brain.
It can't be a tight cause and effect all the way down.
No, because then our belief in materialism would just be a matter of conditioning, and it would be a matter of, you could get people to believe it just by conditioning them to believe it, but that would mean they're just brainwashed into believing it. It wouldn't, the question of whether it's true or not would be irrelevant, because nothing could be true. You could just believe what you're conditioned to believe.
So, in a way, the question is, if we were robots, would we know we're robots? Can a robot know it's a robot? And the suggestion is that it couldn't really.
Well, that it couldn't really, I suppose, unless it was programmed to know it was a robot. It could be programmed to say, I am a robot.
But that wouldn't really be knowing, would it?
No.
Yeah.
You see, I think that there's a problem with materialists in that they always make an exception for themselves. And this comes up in talk of memes by people like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett. They like to say that religion is like a kind of infection of brains. You have memes, which are units of imitation, which leap from brain to brain, and religious people have their brains heavily infected by these virus-like diseases of thinking, which cause them to be religious, and that it's like a parasitic disease of the brain. But when they say this, they put it forward as if it's a rational argument based with all the authority of science, as if these are scientific terms and scientific arguments. But then that leaves the question about what about their own belief in atheism or materialism? Surely, if our minds depend on units of imitation, and if things travel from mind to mind, as atheism certainly does, then that too must have a meme system, a meme complex. And that means that Dawkins and Dennett are heavily infested with atheism memes. Their brains have been taken over by these memes, which are struggling to get out and leap from their brain to yours and mine. But somehow they don't discuss that. You see, I think everyone else has these memes infesting their brains, but they've somehow risen to a pure status of reason and logic and truth that's somehow immune to memes and so forth.
Yeah, so in other words, science would be a meme as much as religion was a meme, and everything would be just on the same epistemological level, as it were. You wouldn't be able to tell which one was true and which one was false.
That's right. They'd all just be a question of which meme got there first and which was the most virulent. You know, it would be like being infected with flu or something. If one strain of flu infected you, you just have that flu.
Wouldn't the parallel be, though, that like genes interact with the environment and give adaptive advantage to the organism, and so therefore the organism survives, it has that adaptive advantage. So too, over time, you would say perhaps that the more successful memes will be the ones that turn out to be what you might say are true, because they're the ones that survive and that, as it were, do away with all the other memes. And I guess that individuals like Richard Dawkins would say that that's exactly the story of science. Science is proving that the religious memes aren't very adaptive, aren't very successful, and so in a way aren't true.
Well, I don't think truth and survival amount to the same thing. I mean, we can't say that the dinosaurs became extinct because they weren't true. They became extinct because of climatic disaster. We can't say that, endangered species today are dying out because they're not true. They're dying out because of climate change, the destruction of their environment and so forth. And it's also an open question as to whether science as a meme system is more long-lived than religion. I mean, religion's been around for thousands of years, science for 400. And it's already created a situation in the world where the very survival of humanity is at stake. It may be that this is a highly destructive set of memes. I mean, that will lead to reckless destruction of the environment and the planet, to a corrosive disturbance and destruction of human society by dissolving the bonds provided by custom, tradition and religion, leaving people as isolated, atomistic individuals, taking Prozac and other antidepressants because it's so depressing to be isolated and individualistic. That it's an open question as to whether in the long run this is a successful meme complex or not, if you judge in terms of survival. But I think survival's a different question from truth. Scientists like to talk about how Giordano Bruno went to the stake in 1600 for his scientific beliefs. Well, he didn't survive very well because of those memes. And this would say that people who die because of their beliefs, as martyrs have done through the ages, whether religious or secular, the memes they've got are unsuccessful because they're being, at least the prime source of infection is being eliminated. I guess that
that's right. The fundamental intuition that truth is not the same as survival would be one that kind of stands up there. I wanted to throw in another thing that's often talked about in this area of free choice, though. The experiments, I think, often associated with Benjamin Libet.
Yes.
And it seems that when we apparently make a decision to do something like, say, touch the table, our brain, as it were, unconsciously is anticipating this decision really quite dramatic periods of time before we actually are conscious of doing it. And this too seems to undermine notions of free choice. It's not that we decide, it's that there's already a cause and effect chain in process, and our decision is just an after effect. It comes fairly late down that chain. What do you make of experiments like that?
Well, it's a rather specialist experiment. People are told that they can raise their finger. They've already made the choice to raise their finger by taking part in the experiment. The only question is when they do it. And this change in the brain called a readiness potential is something that happens, 400 milliseconds before they become aware of making the choice to move their finger. Libet himself doesn't think it undermines free will because he said that after the readiness potential has occurred, there's a time in which you can decide not to do it. So he thinks instead of having free will, we have what he calls free won't. I think that's a point that he himself makes and doesn't believe his own research destroys the concept of free will. But you see, this whole assumption assumes that, first of all, that conscious choices would have to be happen before the change in the brain. It may be that our conscious choices, as it were, spread backwards in time. The Whitehead's theory of the relation of mind and body is that consciousness, as it were, works backwards in time, and its causal influences from the future to the past. So it might raise a completely different point, and a very interesting one, that the consciousness might work in a different way from regular causation. And in fact, Libet's other famous piece of research indicates this. Libet also found, and this is less well known than his so-called free will experiment, that if somebody hears a tone, a buzzing noise, for example, or if there's a mild electric stimulus applied to the back of your hand, if the buzzing tone's applied for 100 milliseconds, a tenth of a second, you don't notice it. 200 milliseconds, you don't notice it. 300 milliseconds, you don't notice it. 400 milliseconds, you don't notice it. But when you get to 500 milliseconds, half a second, you become aware of it. So there's a kind of threshold of the stimulus before you become aware of it. But when people are, asked to indicate when they're aware of it, you become aware of it not after 500 milliseconds, but when it started. That somehow your conscious experience is backdated by half a second. And, if it's 450 milliseconds, you're not aware of it at all. But 500, you're aware of it at the very beginning of the stimulus. Now, that's a very interesting result that shows that our conscious experiences have this backdating quality. They can work backwards in time. His free will experiments are over something like 400 milliseconds. It's the same kind of time range. So I think his research raises a lot of very, very interesting questions about the relation of mind and body. And certainly he himself doesn't think it just means here's scientific proof there's no such thing as free will. But even if there is proof that there's no such thing as free will, then that comes back to the question of how can a materialist freely choose to be a materialist? Are they just one because their brain makes them do it? In that case, a fundamentalist Christian's a fundamentalist Christian because their brain makes them do it. And in fact, any belief system is there just because people's brain makes them do it because of conditioning they've had in the past. Materialists, insofar as they can influence children through science education, may be able to make more of them have brains that make them into materialists, but that doesn't prove it's true. It just proves you got in first in some kind of conditioning system. If a Jesuit had got there first, then they'd be Catholics.
Okay, well, look, let's say that this logic adds up, that it is inconsistent to freely choose to be a materialist. How then do you understand freedom yourself?
Well, I think freedom has to take place in a context of habits and determination. I mean, whatever freedom we have, it's within a fairly narrow limits. I mean, there's certain, I'm not free to wave my arms and fly, at least in waking life. In my dreams, I can. We have more freedom in our dreams than we do in our waking life. But there are certain things, physical limits. And, I'm not free to go and buy the Shard in London for billions of pounds, because I haven't got billions of pounds. So there's all sorts of restraints on our freedom. So there's no doubt everyone would agree that free will can only operate within a certain fairly narrow range, and also that our choices may be determined by unconscious habits and unconscious motives that we may think we're being free when we're not. Nevertheless, I think the concept of free will is absolutely fundamental to our whole society. Without it, the entire criminal justice system would break down. People are held responsible for their acts. If they steal something from a shop or if they murder somebody, they're considered to be guilty if they've done it because they had the freedom not to do that. Now, some people who are mentally very disturbed can plead a charge of guilty but insane, or the balance of mind was disturbed, and that is a legal defence, but it's not a legal defence for most of us. So, in common sense terms, our entire system presupposes that there's a reality of freedom. The educational system, with rewards and punishments, does, and indeed the entire working of society takes some measure of free choice for granted. the entire democratic system takes it for granted. Because if people were simply conditioned to vote Labour or Conservative or Republican or Democrat because their brains made them do it, democracy would be absolutely meaningless.
I mean, that's all very, very persuasive and self-evident, it seems to me. But does that mean that notions like free will just have to float free of the scientific worldview? There's a fundamental incompatibility here, and we just have to put up with it.
Well, no, because the doctrine that there is no freedom of will, which comes from the materialist system, comes from because materialists deny the existence of consciousness as something that can do anything. They say it's just a kind of shadow of brain activity or an illusion. It doesn't do anything. So they remove the entire basis for freedom. Now, of course, they can't really believe this. It means they can't really be materialists. A materialist belief system requires some kind of free choice and freedom to adopt it, as opposed to mere conditioning. And as soon as the materialist leaves the laboratory or the seminar room, then they're in a world where they're subject to the normal laws that the rest of us are subject to, where it's presupposed there's a freedom and responsibility in our choices. So I don't think science proves there isn't freedom and the ability to make choices at all. The assumption that consciousness doesn't exist and can't have freedom isn't a scientific proof, it's a philosophical assumption, it's a materialist assumption, which I think is at variance with the facts, and has inhibited a proper scientific discussion of the nature of free choice, because it says within the framework of science there's no such thing as free choice, so why study it?
So, in other words, the question of free will is like the question of consciousness too. It requires, in a way, a new worldview, because it just won't be squeezed into the materialist worldview.
Exactly. And I think that any materialist who holds a materialist worldview is being inconsistent in doing so, that it's self-contradictory.
Well, so that leaves our question, can materialists have free choice, with a negative answer if they really are going to hold to their materialist point of view?
Exactly, but insofar as they're materialists who think they're believing it because they've freely adopted this on the basis of reason and evidence, they're not materialists. So in that sense, it's a self-contradictory position. Scratch a materialist and you'll find someone just like everybody else, you might say. Exactly, or, watch how they behave with their family and friends, or their pets, or in their own life choices. Well, Rupert Sheldrake, thank you very much.